The political body that met on the Areopagus was charged, among other things, with investigating crimes of sacrilege against the gods. This might account for Paul's appearance before them to explain himself, as well as the manner of Paul's presentation of his message in Acts 17. He wanted to impress upon them that he was not presenting some new cult, but was merely the proponent of a time-honored deity that the Athenians themselves recognized, though only as an unknown god. Even his claim that we ought not to think of carved idols as divine would have resonated with statements made by Greek philosophers, to which many members of the Areopagus would have had to have given their assent. Paul rightly observes that the Athenians were in every way a religiously scrupulous people. Indeed, the city is known, even now, more for its religious buildings than anything else. Any tourist of the excavations of Greco-Roman Athens comes away with the same impression that Paul did at the end of his day of meandering through the city. Athens boasted a grand temple to Olympian Zeus, while only one cluster of pillars remains with partial architraves. One can get a sense for the scale of this building by looking at the size of the people walking by. It was an enormous, an impressive structure attesting to the city's dedication to this, the chief of their gods. Perhaps the best preserved temple of all from the Greek period, the classical period, is the temple of Hephaestus in Athens. This temple was reused as a church in antiquity. Indeed, the roof of the church built within the temple itself is still quite visible, and this may account for its marvelous state of preservation. Since it continued to be used and occupied, its resources, the marble building blocks that created this temple, were not quarried for other, newer buildings. Athens is famed, however, for its Acropolis, a cluster of sacred sites situated on a plateau overlooking the city. The Acropolis was particularly sacred to Athena, the patron goddess of the city, who gave the city its name. This is a bas-relief of Athena dating from the 5th century BC, showing the goddess in a particularly pensive mood. As visitors like Paul followed the path up to the Acropolis, one of the first things they would have noticed was a small temple dedicated to Athena Nike, sitting upon the brow of the Acropolis. Nike was the goddess of victory, frequently portrayed as a winged figure bearing a laurel wreath, the wreath of victory, in her hands. Here she is identified with Athena, to whom the Athenians looked historically for their own victories. Worshippers and visitors to the Acropolis entered the sacred spaces through the Propylaea, an enormous gate surrounded by columned structures. Here's a view of the same from the inside. It is almost like passing through a temple on the way to the sacred temples at the top of the hill. A giant statue of Athena, known as Athena Promachos, once stood opposite the Propylaea, greeting visitors with her imposing presence and letting them know on whose sacred ground they were now standing. One of the two principal temples atop the Acropolis is the Erechtheion. This is a double temple that was built in the late 5th century BC. Its most distinctive feature is the group of columns depicting female devotees of Athena, known as caryatids. One portion of the Erechtheion was dedicated to the worship of Poseidon, god of the sea. The other part was dedicated to Athena. The structure was also supposed to have enclosed the tomb of the mythical kings of Athens, Erechtheus, after whom the temple was named, and Kekrops. The most famous structure on the Acropolis is the iconic Parthenon, dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the Virgin Athena. This structure was once decorated with elaborate friezes depicting mythical scenes of the gods and centaurs and other mythical beings, and also depicting the Pan-Athenaic procession that was the religious highlight of the Athenian religious calendar. Within the Parthenon was a colossal statue of the goddess Athena. This head comes from a miniature version of the statue of Athena Parthenos, the cult statue sculpted by Pheidias for the Parthenon in the mid-5th century BC. The goddess Artemis also enjoyed a shrine on the Acropolis. This is the head from a cult statue of Artemis found on the site, and probably marking the original location of the Artemis shrine. The only building erected on the Acropolis during the Roman period, but more than likely in place long before Paul himself visited the city, was a temple to Augustus and Roma, the deified personification of the city of Rome, the seat of empire. A shrine to the imperial cult, and thus to the ruling power that had brought Greece under its power, was erected in the very shadow of the Parthenon, a reminder of Athens' former greatness and former independence. The inscription from the architrave of the temple bears witness to the shrine's dedication to Rome and Augustus Caesar, who is here named Savior, Soter, notably the same vocabulary used throughout the New Testament to speak of Jesus. Here's a view of what is left of the temple of Rome and Augustus in the space behind the Parthenon on the top of the Acropolis. A temple was also dedicated to Asclepius, god of healing, about halfway down the slope of the Acropolis. Several Greek cities, like Corinth, for example, had sprawling health resorts where the worship of this god had center stage. Here is a bas-relief of Athena, shown here with her helmet and her shield, and Asclepius, who in iconography is always portrayed with a serpent, shown here now in close association. This particular sculpture comes from an honorary decree, but it's fitting to have been found in a place where both the worship of Athena and Asclepius was so well established. At the base of the Acropolis sit the remains of the theater of Dionysus, the god of wine, of the vine harvest, and generally then associated with the more visceral side of life. Tragedies, tragedies were often performed in this theater as part of an annual festival honoring the god Dionysus. This was known as the Greater Dionysiac Festival. The famous Oedipus trilogy of Sophocles, which gave us Oedipus the King, and the Oresteia trilogy of Aeschylus debuted on this stage as part of such festivals. Indeed, all of the known surviving tragedies of Sophocles and Aeschylus were written to be performed here in this arena as part of the sacred rituals offered to Dionysus, which included sacred drama. Athens was indeed a city in which many gods enjoyed long-standing reverence and worship, and into which the new cults entered only with difficulty. The exception to this was, of course, the cult of the Roman emperor, whose favor came to be every bit as important to the city as Athena's favor. It is perhaps not entirely surprising that Acts portrays Paul as having only the most modest success, making inroads into this center both of classical civilization and traditional religion.